When the average person thinks of the word superhero, the first thing that usually comes to mind is Superman, or at least a variation of him. You know, a super strong guy who flies around in a spandex costume, complete with a cape. But for a time, there was one hero that gave the Man of Tomorrow a major run for his money, even outselling him too: Captain Marvel. This is the story of how DC Comics use all of their legal power to kill this once beloved icon, and take his remaining corpse for themselves to reanimate it into the hero known today as Shazam, creating one of the most famous and important lawsuits in all of comic book history, which has led to a domino effect of backstabs and pettiness that is still being acted upon to this day. You might have heard bits of this story before, but I guarantee that I have found some pretty juicy details that have slipped under most people's radar. Hello and welcome to Comic Drake, where I talk about comic books and my name is Drake. Let's talk about it. In April of 1938, the world was changed forever when Superman hit the scenes in Action Comics #1, creating the first superhero as we know them today, and everyone wanted a piece of the pie. Many publishers made their own characters that were either inspired or straight up rip-offs of the Man of Steel. Most importantly for today's video, Fawcett Comics. At this point, everyone knows Superman's original power set.
Faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings at a single bound. The infant of Krypton is now the Man of Steel, Superman.
Fawcett's new superhero Masterman was pretty similar to Soup's, as he was, quote, stronger than untamed horses, swifter than raging winds, braver than mighty lions, wiser than wisdom, and as kind as Galahad. Well, National Comics, DC's original name, wasn't too happy about Masterman and other characters like him, so they started getting trigger happy with both cease and desists and lawsuits. When Fawcett got word from National to cut it out with Masterman, they canceled the book. But they decided to get right back into the game by tapping writer Bill Parker to create a new competing comic. Inspired by the Knights of the Round Table, Parker envisioned a team of heroes, each with their own unique powers, led by one, Captain Thunder, with each member of the team's name combining out to spell the battle cry, Shazam. Fun fact, this seems to be the origin of the literal word Shazam, which has since gone on to become pretty popular to say the least, especially in that alternate universe where that Sinbad movie was made. However, editor Ralph Daig wasn't a fan of the team concept, so Parker just mushed all the characters together into one new hero that would change the course of comic history forever. With art by C.C. Beck, Parker's new hero saw his debut in 1939 in Whiz Comics #2, with the greatest alter ego of all time, which is something that I think has still never been topped. Instead of having a child sidekick that young readers could see themselves in, Fawcett made the kid character into the hero, with young Billy Batson, a down-on-his-luck orphan, meeting a wizard who granted him the ability to turn into an adult superhero, with the powers of wisdom, strength, stamina, power, courage, and speed whenever he said the word Shazam. Because of trademarking issues, Billy's heroic form couldn't be called Captain Thunder, so the name Captain Marvelous was pitched before being shortened to the much catchier Captain Marvel. Also, this dude's most famous nickname is the Big Red Cheese. Definitely not as badass as the Caped Crusader, Man of Steel, or even Scarlet Speedster. But anyway, Whiz Comics was an instant success, spinning onto other books such as Captain Marvel Adventures, Captain Marvel Jr., Mary Marvel, WoW Comics, Master Comics, and the Marvel family. Hell, there was even Hoppy the Marvel Bunny, because comics. The character's popularity only grew over the years, until his solo book became the best-selling comic in the entire market, which Fawcett was more than happy to advertise by putting the largest circulation of any comic magazine right there on the front cover. In a surprising move, National Comics, which at this point was more or less known as DC, didn't come after Captain Marvel, even though the comic was their main competition, and the company had a track record of shutting down similar characters, even from Fawcett. But all of that changed when little Billy Batson became the first superhero to be adapted into a live-action movie.
Shazam!
The company that made the film, Republic Pictures, initially had a deal with DC to produce a Superman movie, but because of an existing contract with Paramount Pictures for the Superman animated series, they couldn't move forward, prompting Republic to go with Captain Marvel instead. Possibly due to their hero continuously overshadowing Superman at every turn, DC finally sent Fawcett a cease and desist. But when they refused to stop publication, DC pulled the trigger at last and took them to court in 1941. And hoping to get some money from the Captain Marvel movie, they also sued Republic Pictures as a co-defendant. But before the lawsuit could go to court, a little thing called the bombing of Pearl Harbor happened, which got in the way with the United States entering World War II, putting off the trial. During the war, both Captain Marvel and Superman continued to sell really, really well, oftentimes devolving into political propaganda for the war effort, complete with racist depictions of the Japanese. But when the dust settled and the Axis was defeated, this supersuit was finally able to have its day in court. With the truly mesmerizing amount of popularity that both heroes had, the legal battle between DC and Fawcett was one of, if not the biggest court case in all of comic history at the time. No stone was left unturned, and every aspect of the two heroes was put under a magnifying glass. Both heroes wore skin-tight costumes with boots and a cape, they both had secret identities that were reporters. Hell, it was even debated that the two had clean-cut faces, and that was enough of a similarity. Years after the lawsuit, editor Roscoe K. Fawcett himself admitted in an interview that, quote,
"The surveys showed the greatest comic book readership was among 10 to 12-year-old boys. I said, give me a Superman, only have his other identity be a 10 to 12-year-old boy, rather than a grown man."
But in litigation, Fawcett Comics argued that both heroes' great feats of strength, durability, and agility couldn't be deemed as wholly original, as many mythological heroes like Hercules, whom Captain Marvel actually draws his strength from, and even other popular characters like Popeye have exhibited superhuman abilities. It's also worth noting that when it comes to flying, Captain Marvel actually had Superman beat by a couple of years. Remember, he was only
able to leap tall buildings at a single bound.
So it's pretty clear that DC was inspired by Fawcett as well. In the end, the ruling was surprising to say the least. The court found that the Big Red Cheese was indeed similar enough to Superman to be considered copyright infringement. But Fawcett still won the lawsuit. See, what had happened is that DC forgot to properly copyright some of their Superman newspaper strips, which resulted in them abandoning their copyright. So it really didn't matter if anyone made their own Superman or Superman-like character. Also, this ruling got Republic Pictures off the hook, and DC had to cover their attorney's fees. Naturally, DC appealed the verdict, and it was overturned in 1951 when the judge ruled that DC didn't abandon their copyright for Superman as a character, rather just the copyright on those specific newspaper strips. At this point in time, though, superhero comics were massively on the decline thanks to a national outrage over them supposedly corrupting children. So instead of continuing to battle DC in court, Fawcett agreed to stop publishing superhero books altogether and settled for $400,000. Oh, but they did sell the rights to reprint Hoppy the Marvel Bunny to Charlton Comics, who renamed him Happy the Magic Bunny. Fawcett's decision to cancel their whole line of superhero comics had a huge impact on the UK market, considering that old Captain Marvel reprints were a massive cash cow for a company called L. Miller & Sons. And to make up for no longer being able to sell those comics, they needed to get creative. L. Miller tasked comic creator Méalóid to make new characters by taking the existing Marvel family and changing them up just enough to where they could be skirting the law. So instead of Billy Batson, a reporter for Wiz Radio who met a wizard that gave him the ability to turn into the heroic Captain Marvel when he said the word Shazam, Méalóid had Michael Moran, a reporter for the Daily Bugle, which by the way came out 8 years before Spider-Man was created, who met a physicist that gave him the ability to turn into the heroic Marvel Man when he said the word Komoda, which is just atomic spelled backwards and with a K. Ironically though, by removing the magical origin of Captain Marvel's powers, changing his costume to mostly blue with letters on his chest, and shortening his name to one word ending in man, Marvelman was more similar to Superman than its predecessor, who was sued out of existence for being too similar to Superman. The rest of the Marvel family got a new coat of legally distinct paint, and when it came time to publish the final Captain Marvel reprint, L. Miller released this cover of a kid exclaiming, "Holy moly, what happened to the Marvel family?" And in the back of the issue, a column page was added, where Captain Marvel Jr. announced to readers that he and the Captain himself have decided to retire and return their powers back to the wizard Shazam. But don't worry, a new duo of heroes were coming soon to take over for him. Despite being a blatant ripoff, the Marvelman comics were an instant success, due in no small part to a ban on non-essential American goods at the start of World War II, which prevented American comics from competing with L. Miller & Sons products. But in what will become a recurring theme throughout this video, tensions between Méalóid and L. Miller started to bubble up, leading to Mick forming his own comic company featuring Captain Miracle as their headline character, which was just a ripoff of Marvelman, complete with the same origin and powers. Yes, for those of you that are keeping track, Captain Miracle is a knockoff of Marvelman, who is a knockoff of Captain Marvel, who is a knockoff of Superman. Things at Anglo's company, though, were troubled to say the least, with it being reported that one time Mick got so annoyed with one of his artists that he Professor X'd the guy down some stairs. Needless to say, Captain Miracle never quite took off, and has become forgotten to anyone but the most dedicated of comic scholars. Following right behind, though, was Marvelman himself, as sales were declining by the end of the decade, especially with the ban on American comics being lifted, causing them to flood the UK market. No longer able to keep afloat, the Marvelman line of comics was officially cancelled, but not forgotten, as it left millions of British children with the dream of flying. Enter Des Skin. This guy was trying his very best to become the British Stan Lee, and after getting fed up with working at Marvel's UK division, he left and founded his own company, Quality Comics, and he got to work on creating Warrior, an anthology comic that was a pioneer in creators' rights, as Quality would let creators own their own work. What a concept! But what's a comic without stories inside of it? As Skin set out to find content to fill his book with, he recalled back to that old Marvelman series, and when he discovered that L. Miller & Sons had gone out of business and the rights to the character were up for grabs, Des purchased them for Warrior, and he shopped around for writers. After a few rejections, Skin was given the number of an up-and-coming writer, known wizard, and Rasputin impersonator named Alan Moore, who had previously expressed a desire to reboot Marvelman, something that he had been working on since he was 11 years old apparently. But although Moore was about to make his childhood dream come true, the reality of the situation would prove to be a monkey's paw, and Alan was soon about to be caught in a whirlwind of drama, commenting years later, quote,
"As with many other points in the Marvelman saga, if I'd known the true circumstances, I'd never have got involved with it in the first place."
The first issue of Warrior hit store shelves in 1982, and alongside his new original series, V for Vendetta, Alan Moore's Marvelman reboot took center stage. Moore's take on Marvelman was a dark deconstruction of the entire superhero genre. You know, his entire shtick that he would later popularize with Watchmen. But since I want to focus on the insane legal battle surrounding Marvelman in this video and not the content of the comics themselves, I'd like to turn it over to my friend Owen Likes Comics to briefly touch on how Alan Moore's Marvelman really changed comics forever. Plus, he's like the British comic tuber, so it would be extremely weird if I didn't include him in at least some capacity.
Alan Moore's Miracleman is one of my favourite comic books of all time, and although I might be somewhat biased given my accent, I think it's one of the most fascinating and significant comics ever made, both for the story itself and how its publication would impact the comic book industry for years to come. Miracleman picks up with a now middle-aged Michael Moran, who has no memory of his time as a superhero. After being caught in the crossfire of a terror attack, Michael suddenly remembers his magic word, uttering it and transforming into Miracleman for the first time in decades. With his memories now restored, Miracleman seeks out the truth behind his disappearance, tracking down his former partner, Kid Miracleman, who is revealed to have become a deluded villain. The pair fight throughout the streets of London, with Miracleman emerging victorious after restoring Kid Miracleman to his human form, revealing that he is actually still a child, having spent the entire time Miracleman was away in his superpowered form. After this, Moore reveals the first of several shocking twists in this series, as we discover that the entire 1950s Marvelman comic series never actually happened, and instead were dreams fed to Miracleman by a shady government organisation. To me, Alan Moore's Miracleman is nothing short of groundbreaking. In many ways, the comic proved to be a testing ground for the ideas that Moore would pioneer in comics like Watchmen, such as recontextualising obscure Silver Age heroes into the gritty nihilistic world of the 1980s, and melding real-world international politics into a story about the uncomfortable reality of what superheroes would be like in our world. And given Miracleman began half a decade before stories like Watchmen, The Killing Joke, and The Dark Knight Returns hit shelves and forever changed the way that comic companies approach their storytelling, it's hard not to see Miracleman as a hugely significant piece of comics history, as well as an incredible story in and of itself. If you'd like to learn more about the history of Miracleman, and specifically Alan Moore's reinvention of the character, I highly recommend heading over to my channel Owen Likes Comics and watching my video on the subject. But before that, I'll hand this video back over to Drake.
Thanks, Owen. Considering that Warrior allowed its creators to own their own work, Marvelman was in a tough position as a pre-existing property. So, in the spirit of fairness, the rights to the character were divided evenly into 3 parts. One would go to Alan Moore, one went to artist Gary Leach, and the remaining third would stay with Des Skin. Warrior was a critical success, and Moore's Marvelman quickly proved to be the crown jewel of the book. But Leach quickly found himself to be unable to meet deadlines. So Alan Davis, the artist that Moore was currently working with in Marvel UK on their Captain Britain series, was brought in to take over the art. Leach did stay on to ink Davis's pencils, but Davis demanded that since he was now handling the artwork, he rightfully deserved a share of the rights to the series. Nobody disagreed, so everyone chipped in with a cut of their rights, with the total being estimated at 28% each for Moore, Leach, and Davis, with Skin keeping the remaining 16%. Despite the praise from fans, Warrior was never really a bestseller, and if the comic was really going to explode, it would need to break into the American market. By using his industry contacts, Des Skin managed to take meetings with both Marvel and DC to try and make a deal. Now, DC loved some of the series inside of Warrior, but had to pass on Marvelman, with Skin recalling that they said something along the lines of, "We love everything you're doing over at Warrior, especially that V for Vendetta book. Groundbreaking. But you think we're gonna publish something called Marvelman? Dude, we went through so much shit with Captain Marvel. Absolutely not." When Skin went to Marvel Comics for a pitch, they basically said, "I mean, we could make that happen, but his name is Marvelman, so people would assume that he represents our entire company. And call me crazy, but I don't think we want this extremely violent comic representing the entirety of the Marvel brand. Also, we really don't like that you're using that name in the first place, so cut it out." Yeah, despite the fact that the original Marvelman comics came out 7 years before Atlas Comics rebranded to Marvel Comics, they decided to throw their weight around to try and stop Warrior in its tracks. But this whole debacle soured Moore's relationship with Marvel, telling them, quote,
"You know you're big. You're ugly. You could obviously stomp us into the ground legally. So obviously we can't call the character Marvelman. Please be assured that at no time in the future will I ever even consider working for Marvel Comics, or with Marvel Comics in any way."
Now, behind the scenes, there were problems with Alan Davis not being properly paid for his work on Marvelman, so he refused to hand in any more artwork. Though at the same time, Moore took his vendetta against Marvel extremely seriously, and used all of his power to prevent them from reprinting his and Davis's Captain Britain series. Davis, on the other hand, really just wanted the easy payday from Marvel, and was pissed that Moore was letting what he considered to be petty revenge stand in the way of that. This, combined with the aforementioned payment issues over at Warrior, led to Davis quitting Marvelman. And Alan Moore wasn't too far behind, leaving Warrior and Marvelman on a cliffhanger due to a falling out with Des Skin, who was trying to get Moore to censor some of the language inside of the book. But not missing a beat, Skin decided to publish the cease and desist letters that Marvel had sent inside of Warrior to use them as a scapegoat to explain the comic's sudden disappearance. Eventually though, Skin found an American publisher in the form of Pacific Comics. But they went bankrupt before the series could ever be published. But then another company, Eclipse Comics, bought a bunch of Pacific stuff, so they negotiated with Alan Moore and Des Skin for the Marvelman publication rights. There was just one small issue. The title. Famously not a fan of corporations getting in the way of artistic expression, Alan Moore was adamantly against changing the name of the series. But when there was no other way out, he advocated for the title Komoda, similarly to how DC got around publishing Captain Marvel by changing that book's name to Shazam. Eventually though, they settled on a new name, Miracleman. But did you notice how I said that Eclipse Comics made a deal with Alan Moore and Des Skin? What about Gary Leach, or Alan Davis, who each owned 28% of the rights to the character? Yeah, well, Eclipse lied to Alan Moore about getting the go-ahead from the artist, and they went right on ahead with publishing their art. Obviously pissed about having his work being reprinted without his permission or compensation, Davis exited the picture entirely, saying, quote,
"I'm so disgusted with the whole affair that I have cut myself free of any future involvement with Marvelman by giving my 30% of the copyright to Gary Leach. I'm glad to be rid of it."
When Eclipse finished reprinting the old Marvelman comics, they were hungry for new content, so they decided to cut out the middleman and go straight to Alan Moore to commission new issues, buying out Skin and Leach's percentage of the rights for $8,000 to make it happen. This brought the split to 72% Eclipse and 28% Moore, meaning that despite Warrior's mission of ensuring that creators own their own work, the lion's share of Miracleman was now owned by a corporation. Regardless, Alan Moore was at long last able to finish his saga, ending up with a completely new name in a completely different country with a completely different publisher. But this wouldn't be the end of Miracleman, because Alan Moore directly reached out to another writer to take over the series, one Neil Gaiman, saying, quote,
"Now, I should warn you, by the end of Miracleman number 16, I will have solved all crimes, ended all war, and created an absolutely perfect world in which no further stories can occur. Do you want to back out now? Please feel free.
To which Gaiman replied, quote,
No, I'd love to.
Wiping his hands clean of it all, Moore transferred his 1/3 share of the Miracleman rights to Gaiman, who in turn divided it, presumably in half, to his artist Mark Buckingham. So, okay, everything about the story has been pretty easy to follow so far. So why have I been making such a big deal about how this is one of the most complicated and important legal battles in all of comic history? And wait a second, I claimed at the beginning of the video that Miracleman changed Marvel Comics. They've only come up in passing once. So what's with that? Well, things are about to get completely bonkers. And while this next part might not seem like it has anything to do with Miracleman or Marvel Comics, I assure you that it's all going to come full circle, and it is going to be a wild ride getting there. So there's this guy named Todd McFarlane, and he is one of the main creators of a company called Image Comics. His character Spawn quickly became the face of the company, and almost instantly became one of the best-selling comics of its time. But here's the thing. Image was founded by a bunch of artists, and not many of them were doing all that well in the writing department. So to combat this, McFarlane brought on a bunch of superstar guest writers for Spawn. Most importantly, Neil Gaiman. Now, here are two people that couldn't be any more different. Neil Gaiman is a soft-spoken British man who writes intricate, thought-provoking tales, with his most famous series, The Sandman, being, to this day, the single most critically acclaimed comic series of all time in terms of awards. Todd McFarlane, on the other hand, is a loud Canadian who can best be described as the Vince McMahon of comics, an over-the-top businessman who's basically a character in his own right. McFarlane was desperate to bring Gaiman on board to add some legitimacy to Spawn, so he offered him the most money that Neil had ever been paid for a single issue up to that point in his career, $100,000. On top of that, Todd promised Gaiman complete creative freedom to do literally whatever he wanted, saying, quote,
You can have 22 pages of Spawn reading the newspaper for all I care. You can make up his past, you can do whatever you like. You have complete creative freedom.
Eventually, Gaiman accepted and wrote Spawn number 9 in 1993, where he created 3 very important characters. The Hellspawn Slayer Angela, the kooky old man who knows far more than he lets on, Count Cagliostro, and a Hellspawn from the 19th century that would later be known as Medieval Spawn. Put a pin in all of that. So back over at Eclipse, Gaiman released Miracleman number 24, and even though number 25 was complete, it was unable to be published because the company filed for bankruptcy. Also during this time, Neil was rather pleased with how his issue of Spawn had turned out, so he decided to write an Angela miniseries for Image for about $30,000, but mostly because his son was a big Spawn fan. I especially love the meta text of this dialogue on the last page, where Angela says, quote,
You don't have to work for the big two. There are alternatives.
This was very clearly a huge dig at Marvel and DC, while simultaneously praising Image Comics for their mission of creators' rights, which is still something that they are extremely vocal about to this day. The Angela miniseries could not have dropped at a more perfect time, because Todd McFarlane had recently created a toy company and was putting out Spawn figures like crazy. And out of the 4 guest writers that were brought on board, only Gaiman's characters got the action figure treatment. The Angela figure specifically was an instant bestseller, mostly because she was the main source of boobs and butt for the entire Spawn franchise. And it even made the front cover of USA Today, where the American Family Association labeled it as the most inappropriate toy of the year, which gave Neil Gaiman a good hearty chuckle. But while Gaiman was sent a check for $20,000 in royalties for the Medieval Spawn figure, he wasn't sent anything for the Angela toys. Not only that, but the Angela miniseries was reprinted as a trade paperback, and Gaiman was only sent an $800 check for it. To make things worse, Todd McFarlane mentioned in an interview around this time that he doesn't send anybody royalties. Just what he liked to call love checks. Well, these supposed love checks, or the lack thereof, didn't seem all that fair to Gaiman, who began to grow increasingly concerned that without a proper contract, he was screwed. I mean, what if Todd got hit by a truck? There wouldn't be any proof that Neil was owed anything. Not to mention that word around town was that Todd was actually thinking about selling his toy company, and no owner in their right mind would be paying out royalties that they legally didn't have to. So, looking to protect their deal, Gaiman went to McFarlane for the rest of what he was owed, and get a written contract that would be at least equal to the one that he had with DC Comics for The Sandman. Todd refused, which is ironic considering that he had once been extremely outspoken about creators' rights, and was now getting in a massive tizzy because of a rights issue. Hell, take a look at this page from Spawn number 10, the issue immediately after Gaiman's, which threw direct shade at Marvel and DC for not giving ownership to the creators of their most iconic characters. To add insult to injury, Todd immediately made a ripoff of Angela named Tiffany, and he threw Medieval Spawn into a crossover with Witchblade that Neil also wasn't paid royalties on. Eventually, though, Neil and Todd came to an agreement. See, McFarlane had recently purchased the remains of Eclipse Comics for $25,000, and he wasn't even all that interested with what he had, saying, quote,
"Some of the stuff is worth reprinting, but for the most part I will need to bring a 90s look to it. I might have access to 100 books, but only do something with 3 or 4 of them."
Now, I mean this with all due respect to anybody who ever wrote for Eclipse. While there was a lot of good stuff in the backlog, only one thing was truly valuable. See, now that he owned the company, this seemingly made Todd McFarlane the owner of Eclipse's 2/3 share to the Miracleman rights. So the proposed deal was that McFarlane would give Gaiman a portion of the owed royalties and would hand over his full share of said rights in exchange for the full ownership of Medieval Spawn and Count Cagliostro. But not Angela though, because Gaiman had already been in talks with Marvel about doing an Angela/X-Men crossover. Regardless, you have to remember that Gaiman was never able to finish telling his Miracleman story because Eclipse had gone out of business, and this would be an amazing opportunity for him to do just that. So the two of them exchanged faxes confirming that the deal was on. But all Todd ever sent Neil were some of the physical Miracleman materials that he had gotten from the Eclipse auction, and checks that totaled about $16,000. But that's it. See, in order to come up with a number for what else he owed Gaiman, McFarlane got in contact with a higher-up at DC about the company's royalty policy on derivative characters, something that Medieval Spawn would absolutely fall into, since he's just Spawn, but at night. This executive mentioned that over at the company, writers aren't owed anything for stuff like that. Like, if someone made a cowboy or a caveman Superman, that's still just Superman, and the writer didn't do enough to warrant royalties. Upon hearing this, Todd became furious and was convinced that Neil had overstated his contract with DC, so he went back on the deal and secretly filed a trademark on Miracleman. Meanwhile, Gaiman was on a signing tour for his recent novel, Stardust, and when he returned home, he found a letter from McFarlane stating that he is withdrawing his previous offer, and instead, he gave a final take it or leave it. No more royalties, no more love checks, and the full rights to all of the Spawn characters, including Angela, in exchange for the Miracleman rights. Needless to say, Gaiman was also pissed that McFarlane was trying to take ownership of his work without proper compensation, especially since Todd had just bought a home run baseball for $2.7 million. This filled Neil with determination, and he swiftly went to work to take Todd down. Now that Todd and Neil were officially at war, McFarlane had a field day against Gaiman, putting out a book called Spawn the Dark Ages, which introduced Dark Ages Spawn, a complete knockoff of Medieval Spawn. Then he created yet another Angela ripoff named Domina, and then straight up killed Angela just a few issues later. But worst of all, Todd released Hellspawn number 6, which introduced a journalist character named Mike Moran, the secret identity and occupation of Miracleman. Just a few months later, McFarlane publicly claimed in an interview that he actually owned all of the rights to Miracleman, and specifically said that Moran was going to transform into his alter ego later on in the Hellspawn series, thus making Miracleman an official part of the Spawn universe. A cover was drawn up and everything, but it never came to fruition, which is really weird if McFarlane actually owned all the rights as he claimed. 1 month later, Todd's trademark for Miracleman lapsed, so he registered it again. But it was contested by A&H Sportwear Company, who said that Miracleman was close to infringing on their trademark for Miracle Suit. Weird. While McFarlane was loudly flaunting his supposed ownership of Miracleman, Gaiman was secretly in talks with Marvel Comics for an all-star team-up. You see, Neil had been trying his best to handle this dispute with Todd outside of court, but it was becoming increasingly clear that McFarlane needed to be dealt with in a more direct fashion. The only issue, though, is that lawsuits are expensive, and this is where Marvel Comics enters the picture. In October of 2001, Marvel held a press briefing announcing that Neil was coming on to write a brand new series, later revealed to be Marvel 1602. They also announced the formation of Marvels and Miracles LLC, a property fund directly made to aid the acquisition of the Miracleman rights from McFarlane, with the profits of 1602 going directly to the endeavor. If they won, Marvel promised that Miracleman would get his original name, Marvelman, back, a fair amount of the profits from any re-released Marvelman books would go to their original creators, and any leftover cash would go to comics-based charities. Oh, and when 1602 did eventually come out, there was a special little bit in the dedication section where Gaiman thanked Todd for making it necessary. With the war chest filled, Neil Gaiman, along with Marvels and Miracles, launched an official lawsuit for the Miracleman rights, the Spawn characters, and the unauthorized use of Gaiman's name and biography, without royalties, for a newly reprinted copy of his Angela miniseries. When the motion was filed, McFarlane tried his very best to get public opinion on its side by complaining that the impending lawsuit was the reason why the Image 10th anniversary special was delayed. It was not, by the way, and surprisingly, that's going to come up later. The trial was pretty open and shut, ruling in favor of Gaiman on all counts, but the damages are where things get interesting. See, Neil won $45,000 in damages for the unauthorized use of his name and biography on the Angela trade paperback, and $33,639.40 in attorney's fees. But he was additionally able to take one of two options. Either he could ask for the enforcement of the deal to trade his Spawn characters for the Miracleman rights, or he can receive royalties on everything he was owed since 1994, which included a cut of the over $5 million worth of his characters being merchandised and featured in both the Spawn movie and animated series. Obviously, the latter was the more lucrative option for Gaiman, so he took it. But quick side note, as a part of the owed royalties, Gaiman apparently received just $34 for some medieval Spawn pogs that really didn't sell well. Definitely not a poggers move. Another possible reason why Neil didn't enforce the previous trade was because Gaiman had a hunch that this whole debacle over Miracleman's ownership might be more complicated than first imagined, and there was a solid chance that he could get those rights by other means. More on that here in a bit. In spite of the literal trials and tribulations, though, Gaiman and McFarlane were respectful to each other throughout this entire process, and after court let out, they both signed a copy of Spawn that was used as evidence as a gift to a kid that was in the courtroom. But as we'll soon find out, this civility was very short-lived on Todd's part. In theory, this would be a really good place for McFarlane to end things, considering that he got his ass royally handed to him in court. But with Todd being Todd, he felt the need to poke the bear. A year after the trial, McFarlane Toys announced they're releasing a Miracleman statue, despite the fact that Neil absolutely still owned a percentage of the character and didn't give his permission for this. Todd even put the statue in an exclusive 2-pack with Spawn for San Diego Comic-Con, and he had a Spawn/Miracleman poster drawn up as well. Gaiman publicly posted on his blog that Todd's statue was astonishingly ugly, and announced that Marvels and Miracles had tapped the man who had previously done statues for the Sandman to make a Miracleman statue of their own, which in my opinion looks a hell of a lot better than that edgelord version that Todd was trying to peddle. But what follows is perhaps the single biggest twist of this entire saga. So naturally McFarlane appealed the previous lawsuit, but his rationale was that he believed the characters that Gaiman had created for Spawn were too generic to have any claim over them. Now, this was just plain ridiculous, so when they went back to court, Todd lost again. But throughout these legal shenanigans, this bombshell dropped. It turns out that Todd never had any of the rights to Miracleman this entire time. All that he had was a trademark for the logo, and since that had expired, he didn't even own that. You see, when Des Skin and Gary Leach sold their rights to Miracleman to Eclipse Comics, a clause explicitly stated that if the company folded or changed directors, then the rights would revert back. But revert back to who? That would actually come to light years later, and it's deeply fascinating, so stay tuned. Now, even though it was proven that McFarlane didn't have any claim to Miracleman whatsoever, he still boasted about owning 100% of the rights. And despite it being 3 years late, he continued to publicly claim that the reason behind the constant delays behind the Image 10th anniversary special was because Gaiman was being stingy with its character rights. Gaiman, however, stated on his blog that he was never asked about the book, and in response to McFarlane's claim over Miracleman's ownership, Neil said that Todd was distancing himself from the reality-based community. When the 10th anniversary special finally hit store shelves, it was rebranded as the Image Comics hardcover, presumably out of sheer embarrassment. But in it, a character that appeared to be Miracleman showed up in the Spawn section, but that was explained away as actually being a dude called the Man of Miracles, or MOM for short. Although a digital copy of the book was never made, and I tried my absolute best to find an image of this cameo online, we can still see just how much this character was clearly meant to be Miracleman, because of course Todd made another goddamn statue. Now, possibly in a move to protect himself from yet another lawsuit with Gaiman, Man of Miracles got a significant redesign in his first full appearance in Spawn number 150. But he was later revealed to be the shape-shifting mother of existence, the most powerful entity in the entire universe, surpassing both God and the devil.
Sure, Jan.
Though, try as he might, Todd was not done getting his ass handed to him in court by Gaiman. But before we get to that, let's talk about the true place where the rights to Marvelman ended up, because at this point, it had just come to light. See, it turns out that when L. Miller & Son closed shop, the rights to Marvelman had reverted back to Mick Anglo. And when Des Skin said that he got the rights for Warrior, what he had actually done was pay a visit to Mick to get his blessing for the reboot and give him some money under the table. So, while the Marvelman series over at Warrior was above board with the full consent of the original creator, the rights were never actually Skin's in the first place, and he legally never should have been able to parse them out to everyone. This also means that when Eclipse went straight to Alan Moore and later Neil Gaiman to commission new issues of the series, they didn't pay Mick Anglo, and thus, they never had any legal rights to the character either. Evidently, Anglo sold the rights to the character to a group called Emotive & Company for £4,000, and they instantly got to work shopping around for investors that were willing to produce a Marvelman movie to no avail. But now that the truth of the matter had finally come to light, Marvel got in touch with Anglo and Emotive to purchase the rights for themselves, and they went ahead and reprinted the old school comics, which I have a copy of right here. It's interesting to note that throughout Marvel's announcement of the acquisition, the name Miracleman was never used, implying that the jury was still out on whether owning Marvelman also gave them the rights to the Warrior/Eclipse incarnation of the hero as well. Meanwhile, Neil Gaiman took Todd McFarlane to court again, claiming that Tiffany, Domina, and Dark Ages Spawn were all knockoffs of his characters. The trial came and went, with Todd of course pausing for photos with his lawyer, and naturally, the judge ruled in favor of Gaiman, who was thus entitled to half of all of the profits those characters have accrued over the years. The judge even questioned why McFarlane felt the need to rip off Medieval Spawn in the first place, by straight up busting out the comic lore. She basically said,
"Two knights from the same century? I don't buy it. We all know that Hellspawn never comes to Earth more than every 100 years minimum. If you really want to differentiate between the two characters, then why not make him a gladiator, or a conquistador, or an aristocrat in the King Dynasty?"
Unfortunately for Neil Gaiman, it would be a long time before he was paid any of the owed money, because Todd, who can start a fight in an empty room, had gone bankrupt due to a completely separate lawsuit. A couple of years later though, the two creators finally settled, but they kept the terms of their agreement confidential. Neil did end up commenting years later that they had made a trade, with Todd receiving Cagliostro and Medieval Spawn in exchange for Gaiman keeping Angela and the other derivative angels. It can also be surmised though that this deal included Todd forever backing off of Miracleman. Thank God. In addition to that, Todd's financial records came out when he exited bankruptcy, where it was revealed that he had paid Neil $1.1 million for this entire ordeal, which all of course went to charity as per Gaiman's wishes. When asked by a fan if he had any hard feelings towards Todd about their feud, Gaiman said, quote,
"Read the timeline. How could you have any respect for someone who behaved like that over and over?"
Something that is endlessly fascinating is that although Miracleman was a core part of these continuous legal battles, the matter of who owned him never actually went to court. It just kind of chilled in the background. But even though all of the lawsuits are finally over at this point, that does not mean that the story ends here. We don't know what the exact deal was, but Gaiman gave the rights to Angela and Miracleman over to Marvel, with the Angelic Warrior making her debut in Age of Ultron number 10, with the most appropriate line ever.
"I'm an angel from the heavens and I will not be disrespected."
In the Marvel Universe, Angela was reworked into the long-lost sister of Thor. Then she became a member of the Guardians of the Galaxy, followed by the ruler of Asgard's Hell. But of course, there's the case of Miracleman, and at long last, I am happy to say that the Warrior/Eclipse series was reprinted, complete with Neil Gaiman and Mark Buckingham coming on board to return to that story they set out to tell all those years ago. Alan Moore, having become disillusioned with this whole ordeal, didn't want his name anywhere on the Marvel reprints, and is simply credited as the original writer, with any royalty payments that he might accrue going directly to the estate of Mick Anglo, who sadly passed away a few years before the book could hit store shelves. It's also worth noting that Marvel Comics refers to and brands Marvelman and Miracleman as two separate characters, keeping the former in reference to the Mick Anglo era incarnation, which in my opinion is a great move. But there's one question that has been on the mind of many comic fans, including myself. Will Miracleman stay in his own self-contained universe, or will he be coming over to the Marvel Universe proper? The answer, and the reason I made this deep dive in the first place, is because at the time of this recording, Marvel has put out a comic called Timeless, which teases a glimpse into the future of the Marvel Universe, and it all ends on Miracleman's cryptic emblem. Personally, I have no idea what the company is going to do with Miracleman, because he's honestly a little redundant at this point, considering that they already have a hero named the Sentry who's got that whole shtick of being a long-forgotten hero from the Golden Age taken care of. Regardless though, I have become a huge fan of Miracleman throughout making this video, and I am just really excited to see what comes out next. That was a lot about Miracleman, but whatever happened to Captain Marvel? With Fawcett's Captain Marvel out of the picture, a company called MF Enterprises decided to swoop on in and start publishing one of their own in 1966 out of pure spite. But the target of this attack wasn't Fawcett or even DC, but rather another company entirely, Timely Comics. Timely got into the superhero game with their debut hero, the Human Torch, an android who could ignite into flames. Well, the Torch's creator, Carl Burgos, was pretty ticked off that Timely kept a hold of the copyright for his baby, and decided to create this new Captain Marvel, an android with the ability to detach parts of his body, as a middle finger to his former employer. See, as you might have guessed, Timely rebranded over the years, becoming Atlas and eventually Marvel Comics, and these guys were trademarking anything they could think of that included the word Marvel, which of course included, say it with me, Captain Marvel. Well, Burgos was able to beat them to the punch with this new hero, and seemingly wanted to get back at the entire industry that had scorned him by ripping off everybody he could think of. His Captain Marvel was the sole survivor of a doomed planet a la Superman, had a child sidekick named Billy Baxton, and fought villains with similar names and even similar powers of already established characters, including Plastic Man, Dr. Fate, the Destroyer, and the Bat, who was totally just Batman, so they changed his name to The Ray, which is another character that already existed. Marvel offered MF Enterprises $6,000 for the trademark, but they refused. So Marvel retaliated by making a Captain Marvel of their own. This character was an alien spy named Mar-Vell, who went down to Earth, and when people misunderstood his name, he was given the moniker Captain Marvel. MF certainly didn't appreciate that, so they sued Marvel Comics for trademark infringement, later agreeing to drop the case altogether for a now reduced $4,500. With this victory under Marvel's belt, that should be the end of this whole nonsense, right? No. Because guess who's back? It's DC Comics with the steel chair! So over at DC, they decided to take advantage of Fawcett not being allowed to publish their superhero comics for a couple of decades, and got the rights to license the characters. Yeah, DC was the entire reason that Fawcett stopped in the first place, and they had the damn audacity to do this. I mean, I get the whole adage of if you can't beat them, join them, but wow. Though, imagine how wild it would be if MF never entered this conversation and it was Marvel who decided to snatch up these licenses as a screw you to DC instead of creating Mar-Vell. Unfortunately though, we don't live in that timeline. And when trying to figure out what to do with their newly licensed characters, DC came to the conclusion that Fawcett's goofy old Captain Marvel wasn't really a good fit for the kind of stories that they were currently putting out. So the licensed Fawcett books were relegated to their own self-contained universe. Though to try out the idea of incorporating the Big Red Cheese into the DC universe proper, they made a stand-in for him in the Superman comic with the character Captain Thunder, a callback to Fawcett's original name for the hero. Look, I get that at this point in time, DC did have the official license to the character, but it's pretty ironic that they would blatantly do this, considering their whole history of claiming that Captain Marvel was a ripoff of Superman. And quick side note here, but while I was editing the video, I found this page from a Shazam comic, which has this Captain Thunder and a reference to the MF Enterprises Captain Marvel. It's just such a huge treat for those of us that know all about this crazy legal history. All of that aside though, there was one major hurdle for DC to overcome before they could release their Captain Marvel book: the title. And that means that we're going to need a quick lesson on the differences between trademarks and copyrights. While copyright protects an original work and intellectual property, a trademark protects branding. This means that even though both Marvel and DC had heroes that were called Captain Marvel, they were different enough so that both characters could legally be published at the same time, since nobody would reasonably think that the two characters are one and the same. As a result, this means that both heroes are allowed to be referred to as Captain Marvel inside of their respective books, but the comic's title is a whole different story entirely, and only one publisher is allowed to use it. Since Marvel had the title first, they got the trademark, thus forcing DC to pick a new title for their Captain Marvel comic. DC settled on Shazam for the title, the word that Billy Batson uses to transform, but they were able to put the original Captain Marvel right there on the cover. That is, until Marvel got pissed off and made them remove it by issue 15. But here's the funny thing about trademarks. In order for a company to keep one, they need to continuously use it, and this put Marvel in a position where they were forced to really try and make their Captain Marvel a thing, which is why in 1968, Marvel got his very own comic, which didn't sell very well. Honestly, sales of Captain Marvel have never really been all that great, even when they tried changing up the characters that had the mantle like Monica Rambeau and Marvel's son, Genis. This finally changed in 2012 though when Carol Danvers took over the mantle after being quite popular as Miss Marvel for years. So now, Marvel is finally making good money off of the Captain Marvel name and isn't pumping out comics solely to keep the trademark. DC Shazam Comics saw the return of original Captain Marvel artist C.C. Beck, but he quickly wasn't a fan of how the company was handling his character. Beck eventually left over these creative differences, stating in an editorial that DC was, quote,
trying to kill Captain Marvel, bury him, and then drive a stake through his lifeless body. Now, at last, they've succeeded.
The release of Shazam was exciting for comic fans at the time, as Captain Marvel had become something of an urban legend, a long-forgotten hero with so much legal history behind him that he seemed taboo. But when what readers got was a hokey old-fashioned hero that wasn't anything like the more serious books of the era, which catered to older audiences with darker and more political themes, Shazam quickly fell out of favor. The licensing deal that DC struck with Fawcett required them to pay up every time that one of their characters was used, so when the Shazam series ended, DC wasn't all that excited to keep paying them to use the characters more often. Eventually though, DC did buy the rights to Captain Marvel and his supporting cast outright, later followed by the purchase of Fawcett itself. And that brings us to 1985, when the iconic event Crisis on Infinite Earths blew through the company like a hurricane. This series served two purposes: to streamline the company's increasingly convoluted continuity, and to bring characters from other companies that DC had acquired over the years into the DC universe proper. Enter Roy Thomas. Now, Roy was a big-shot writer and editor over at Marvel Comics, and was considered to be Stan Lee 2.0. He was a devoted company man who took over the X-Men when Stan Lee stopped writing them, and even became Marvel's editor-in-chief when Stan stepped down in 1972. During his 15-year tenure, Roy Thomas and Marvel Comics were synonymous, which is why it was a huge deal when DC managed to poach him for themselves. One of the big reasons why Thomas came over in the first place, though, was because he was a massive Captain Marvel fan, which is why, to no one's surprise, one of the first books that he wrote for DC was a crossover where Cap and Superman switched power sets. Thomas went on to write a few more crossovers between the two heroes, but his biggest dream was to create a full-on rebooted Shazam series. But DC didn't think that the time was right for it, though after a ton of persistent pestering, they eventually gave in, and artist Don Newton was brought on to draw the comic. Roy Thomas pitched the idea for one of Captain Marvel's companions to be named Captain Thunder as an homage to the original name that Fawcett was going to call their flagship character all the way back in the 30s. Roy's Captain Thunder was going to be a black teenager in a wheelchair named Willie Fawcett, and was set to replace Freddie Freeman, aka Captain Marvel Jr. But since DC didn't own the characters outright yet and were simply just licensing the Captain Marvel IP from Fawcett, Fawcett had a degree of control over the comics that they produced, and DC didn't think that they'd be cool with such a drastic redesign. Though that wouldn't matter because unfortunately the series artist Don Newton passed away in 1984, and the Shazam project was put on hiatus. That being said, Captain Marvel still appeared in plenty of comics since then, and was starting to get a lot of interest from fans. So DC went on ahead and put out a new miniseries called Shazam: The New Beginning, which rebooted the character. Written by Roy Thomas and his wife Dan, The New Beginning was noticeably darker in tone. Where the original Captain Marvel books were bright, silly, and goofy, this reboot opened with Billy Batson's parents dying in a car crash. So yeah, a little bit darker. Because he didn't want his Uncle Dudley to find a better paying job to support both him and Billy and give up his dream of being a magician, Batson opted to instead live with his uncle, Dr. Savannah. Savannah was abusive, and when Billy overheard that he was actually the one that orchestrated the car crash that killed his parents for the insurance money, he ran away. And while on the run, Billy was led into a tunnel where he found the wizard Shazam, who granted Billy his powers, thus becoming Captain Marvel. They also decided to take a villain from way back in the 40s that only appeared in one issue named Black Adam and rework him into a menacing main antagonist, setting him up as the dark parallel to Captain Marvel. Dude, when Black Adam found Billy in his non-superpowered form, he was willing to straight up murder the kid for talking back to him, not knowing that he was Captain Marvel. The New Beginning was really well received, so DC finally let Roy Thomas get his dream gig, a monthly ongoing Shazam comic. But his pitch was, different, to say the least. To kick things off, Captain Marvel's design was going to get a massive overhaul. Instead of being the big barrel-chested hero from the past, this new look was going to be leaner and have an emphasis on being cool. What that means that he was going to try and emulate the icons of the era, like Bruce Springsteen, Clint Eastwood, Prince, and Michael Jackson. But definitely not Fred McMurray. They specifically wanted to make that clear. And yeah, the influence of these icons is extremely apparent. Like, if you told me that this was one of Prince or MJ's new costumes, I would totally believe you. Quick unrelated fun fact, there was actually a full-on Prince comic that was written by Dwayne McDuffie, the creator of Static Shock and the head writer of a lot of the Ben 10 series until his untimely death. It's not really relevant for this video, but I don't know when I'm ever going to get a chance to talk about Prince on this channel again, so yeah, there you go. Anyway, the first arc of this new Shazam series was going to introduce a new Mary Marvel. But unlike previous incarnations where she was Billy's sugary sweet sister, this new Mary was dark and had attitude. She goes by Spike, dresses in leather, and has a multicolored mohawk. She also has an abusive boyfriend who's trying to pressure her into being a prostitute, and was no longer Billy's sister so that she could be set up as a love interest for Batson and provide lots of sexual tension. Which is kinda weird considering that Billy is a child and she seems to be quite a bit older than him. But don't worry, Roy Thomas assures us that they are definitely the same age. The comic's first arc was going to set up the Marvel family, which allowed Thomas to reuse the concept of Captain Thunder that he had previously pitched. Although, he would have to pick a different name, because Roy decided to use it in a completely different project because he really liked the sound of it and was convinced that he was never actually going to get the opportunity to make this comic in the first place. The comic opened up with a nondescript Middle Eastern man threatening to blow up the Golden Gate Bridge in the name of an unnamed holy war if California didn't change the state bird to a camel. That's not a because comics moment. What the actual fuck, Roy? Though, after that situation was dealt with, the issue's next scene was going to have a legitimately funny bit. See, there was a kids show on local TV that was based on Captain Marvel, and when Billy asked if they had Cap's approval, the head of the station said that because Captain Marvel wasn't trademarked, then that was completely fair game. And that is all hilariously ironic considering the real-world trademarking shenanigans that the character had gone through over the years. I can't tell if this was meta or if it was just unintentionally brilliant. Afterwards, Spike tracks down and confronts Billy, saying that she saw him disappear into the tunnel and emerge as Captain Marvel back when he first got his powers. Billy drops all the exposition where he goes over his origin story with the wizard, and Spike demands that Batson take him to get the same superpowered makeover. Billy hesitates to agree initially, but then Spike starts shouting, "I know who Captain Marvel really is!" And when Billy tried to get her to be quiet, she gives him a black eye, and that somehow convinces him to comply. So essentially, Spike goes to the wizard and is like, "Hey, you punk-ass bitch, give me some damn superpowers." And despite disrespecting him, the wizard goes ahead and does just that. So now, Spike is Mary Marvel, with a much more revealing costume than her previous incarnation. There were actually multiple designs that were drawn up for Mary that featured all sorts of radical late 80s fashion. I especially like how this one is basically just the god-awful costume that Power Girl was wearing in the 90s, which I talk all about in my award-winning video on the history of Power Girl's costumes and boob window. Anyway, the first thing that Mary did when getting her powers was beat up her abusive boyfriend and raid a local mall to steal some clothes. Really though, that's all we know, because the artist on the project, Mark Beecham, took his sweet time on the project, and after about 6 months of waiting on the artwork, Roy Thomas started shopping around for a new artist. While all of that was going down though, a Shazam story was slated to appear in Action Comics Weekly, but since they wanted to save the big dramatic overhaul for the release of the Shazam solo comic, DC opted to keep Captain Marvel's appearance in these stories in line with his classic barrel-chested design. The new artist Frank Trevlin fully penciled the first 2 issues of Roy Thomas's project, but DC changed their mind and wanted a new artist, Mike Gustovich, to take over and make major alterations to Trevlin's work. But even then, DC wasn't satisfied, and by now, there were 2 or 3 fully drawn copies of the first issue. Oh, and on top of that, because the project was delayed for so long, DC demanded that the first issue be rewritten altogether so that Captain Marvel could be fully reintroduced to readers, even though The New Beginnings wasn't really all that old and took care of just that. It was decided that the first issue of the comic was now going to feature the redesigned Captain Marvel fighting the Teen Titans villain Mammoth. But then DC was like, nah, that plot's too basic for a first issue, it's not very exciting. And then, they canceled the book entirely. Understandably, Roy Thomas was pissed, especially because in all of that time that the comic was being written and rewritten, drawn and redrawn, Thomas was told that he wasn't allowed to work on some of his favorite characters like the Spectre and Dr. Fate, but DC assured him that that was fair because he would still get to work on Shazam, which the company knew was his dream project. And now, he didn't even have that. All Roy Thomas had was wasted time and crushed dreams. To absolutely no one's surprise, Thomas left DC shortly thereafter. And actually, he did a lot less work in general for the big 2 moving forward. But when he did take writing gigs, he mostly went to Marvel instead of DC. And it really seemed like this entire experience seemed to sour his opinion on the modern comic book industry altogether. But it's still an interesting story of what could have been. It wouldn't be until DC's second reboot, Flashpoint, that their Captain Marvel would finally get renamed, officially becoming Shazam. At long last, this whole debacle over the name could finally be put to rest. And it's a change that just made sense. As writer Jeff Johns explained in an interview, quote,
"Everybody thinks he's called Shazam already outside of comics."
But here's the thing. This decision is also pretty damn stupid, since Shazam logically shouldn't be able to say his own name without changing back to Billy Batson. And don't try to tell me that's a dumb concern, because this very conundrum was played around with pre-Flashpoint by Captain Marvel Jr., whose magic words are Captain Marvel instead of Shazam since he gets his powers directly from Billy and not the wizard. It's a whole thing. The solution in the reboot was that in order for Billy to make his magic word work, he has to say it with meaning and conviction as if it were a magic spell. And fine, that makes sense.
I'm gonna be entirely real. I have no idea how to end this compilation because all of these videos are meant to reference each other, so they all end with like, well, if you like this, then go watch part 1 or go watch part 2, but it doesn't really apply considering that it's all one big hour-long video. But hey, there's no sponsors bogging you down. And also on top of that, they've all been remastered with higher quality assets and better editing that more lines up with my current style. Plus, I even got new YouTuber cameos to read the quotes for videos where I wasn't doing that. So it's an even bigger collab. But honestly, thank you guys so much for watching this. Thank you for bearing with me as I do a couple of compilations while I work on my big 500,000 subscriber special. It has been a great 10 years, and thank you so much for letting me entertain you, and thank you so much for letting me have my dream job. I hope to do this for many more years. Thank you.